Good evening, comrades. Thanks for joining us on May Day 2025. Despite the heat outside, it's good to see comrades joining us tonight. We want to have a look today. We've squeezed this session in. We want to have a look today at the communist fusion process that's currently occurring, and which, on the far left, that's a relatively exciting prospect for me anyway. I think it's a very good initiative to bring together different organizations from different trends, from different histories, etc., political histories, trying to build a multifactional, open, democratic organization, Communist Party, in which we can disagree with each other and hopefully fight for actually what's necessary and not what we think people will want to hear. Often the two are the same, but not always. Apologies at the beginning. Kat Rylance from Prometheus, unfortunately, is sick last minute, unfortunately, and so she couldn't find a replacement from Prometheus. So tonight's just going to be Nick Rack and Mike McNair. Mike McNair from the Communist Party of Great Britain, Nick Rack from Talking About Socialism. And then we can open up for questions, contributions from the floor, and we welcome those as always. So Nick's going to make a start, about 15, 20 minutes, then Mike, and then we'll ask some questions. Over to you, Nick. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Tina. And thanks to Mike for participating with me. My commiserations for Kat for not being here. I hope she gets better soon. I'd like to start by sending May Day greetings, Solidarity May Day greetings to everybody watching, to every worker in Britain and internationally struggling to survive under the capitalist system. I want to send May Day greetings and solidarity to all those who are protesting against the genocide in Gaza. The figures that I've seen today suggest that as a minimum, over 52,000 people have now been murdered, massacred in the Israeli attacks on Gaza. And so on May Day, traditionally International Workers' Day, established as International Workers' Day by the founding conference of the Second International in 1889, the first May Day demonstration under its auspices, May Day the following year, following a suggestion from American socialists and the American labor movement to call such a day and have it in the yearly diary. From the beginning, May Day was seen as a solidarity event, an indication of workers' strength, but it was also practical. The events in America, Chicago, with the Haymarket Massacre, arose out of a strike that began on the 1st of May for the 8-hour day, and following attacks on two demonstrations on the 3rd and then the 4th of May, in which workers were killed, it was taken up internationally. But as I say, from the beginning, the struggle for the 8-hour day, a very practical question for the international workers' movement. And May Day has got a long and honourable tradition. I have to say, as an aside, that some of the May Day demonstrations that I've attended in Britain over the last few years have not been so not been so great. Put it that way. The labour movement in Britain doesn't really take it seriously, and they ought to. But it's a good indication of the idea of workers' internationalism and the struggle for socialism. And I'm going to just make this point now, that on these May Days in the past, we have rabble-rousing speeches from labour leaders, trade union leaders, and they talk about one slice of bread isn't enough, we want the whole bakery, and things like this. But most of them don't mean it, and they never repeat it again, and they never do anything to implement that. So the idea of socialism or communism is trotted out for speeches or speechifying, and that's about it. In fact, today you'd be hard pressed to get many of the trade union leaders to even talk about a new society, a different society. Most of them are focused entirely on trade union struggles and limited in that regard. So starting off with solidarity, with May Day greetings, and posing a question really for the Marxist left in Britain and internationally about where we see capitalism and how we see it being overthrown and what we want to replace it with and how we're going to do all of that. I'm sure from the audience, because I've participated in many of these meetings, not all, but the idea of socialism, communism will be ABC. People will be in one or another organization or in none. Some will have been in organizations. My position in approaching this issue is this, and I'll pose it simply in order to help provoke discussion. When Marx and Engels wrote, particularly in the latter part of their lives, towards the end of Engels' life and so on, he was clear, and Marx was clear, that the conditions were being laid, if not had already been laid, for a new society in which the needs of everybody on the planet could be met. My position is that in the 150 years that have passed since then, the conditions for socialism or communism, depending on which word you prefer, are even stronger, greater, readier, if you like. The system is calling out for a new way of being organized, a new society. Capitalism has developed the productive forces, and it's continued to develop the productive forces, but under capitalism, those productive forces come up against their own barrier. Production is socialized, but it doesn't burst out of the private ownership that contains it. And to develop the productive forces, to meet the needs of everybody, we need to burst that shell, the shell of private ownership and the shell of the nation state. And we need to create a new society. Of course, in the process of developing the productive forces, it's also, capitalism has produced the massive, absolutely huge proletariat. Marx and Engels talked about this in the Communist Manifesto, the gravedigger of capitalism. And that was in 1847, 1848. Just to look at the world today, and in almost every continent, in almost every country, the working class is not just a majority, but a significant majority. If the working class had the consciousness and the understanding and the organization, the consciousness that it has the power to change things, then things could be changed. Nothing happens without workers. Nothing is produced, no food is grown, nothing is transported. It's the working class that does all of that. And yet they have no control over the product that they create. And what we have is production under capitalism for the creation of surplus value from which profit comes, rather than the production of goods for their use, for their need. And we need to change that. And we need to have a society, a system, communism or socialism, whichever, as I say, you prefer, in which the means of production are no longer owned by private capitalists, whether that's shared ownership or individual groups of capitalists, but it's owned, the means of production are owned collectively, in common, democratically, because that is the only way that production can be planned properly to meet the needs of society. Now, the ideas of communism, socialism, in my opinion, have been pushed back, particularly over the last 30 or 40 years. They're not such commonplace as they once were, although at the same time, there is a resurgence or an upsurge, in my opinion, in Marxist ideas. But I think that it's a mistake for communists to underestimate the attraction of our ideas, because people are clearly fed up with the system and they're looking for alternatives. And in the absence of a clear, confident, coherent, organized communist party that posits a completely different way of running the world, in which every worker would participate in the decisions about how that world is run. In the absence of that, workers are tempted to look elsewhere, or they're frustrated, or they're demoralized, or they're depressed because they don't see an alternative. I think that the ideas of communism are extremely attractive, they're positive, they're realistic, they're sensible, they're rational, and they actually tie in with the experience of every single worker who goes to work, who looks at his or her pay packet and knows what they've produced and knows what profits have been produced, and looks and questions, why am I doing this for them for only this amount of money? I can't afford my rent. I can't pay my gas bill. I can't send my children to school in the morning with breakfast. They are crying out for a systemic change, and we do not present it as confidently, as boldly as we should and as we can. If you go back to the Communist Manifesto, Marx laid down a challenge or a question to the bourgeoisie. He said, you, Mr. Bourgeois, you complain that we are coming after your private property. And he says, yes, Mr. Bourgeois, that's exactly what we're doing. We're coming after your private property. And he posed, or Marx and Engels posed in that pamphlet, what he called the property question. And that is still the question. Who owns the means of production, and therefore who benefits from the product of the labor that goes into those means of production? And that's what needs to change. And we need to expropriate the capitalist class. And I think the question then, who's going to do that? Well, in my opinion, it's the working class. The working class is the only force in society that can do that. It has the position in production, it has the power, it has the strength, it has the coherence. What it's lacking at the moment is its own consciousness of the task that history has posed for itself. So if it's the working class, how does the working class get the ideas? Well, I've already said that the ideas of communism are almost inherent. The understanding of capitalism is almost inherent in every aspect of a worker's life. But we need to go further than that, in my opinion. Those of us who are blessed, if you like, with an understanding of what is required, and I do see it as a blessing. It can sometimes be a curse. I'm doing this meeting tonight instead of watching Manchester United on the TV. But we are blessed with having what we think is the answer, and the answer is communism. So what do we have to do to meet up to the obligations that is posed to us as communists? We have to take the ideas to the working class, where they will be eagerly accepted, they will resonate. The reason we don't have a big communist party, one reason anyway, is that very few people argue for communism. Very few people put the arguments for communism. If more people stood on their ideas rather than standing on other people's ideas, we would make further, quicker, and better headway. So, what are we talking about in this meeting? The unity of communists. I just want to say in passing, I'm not at all opposed to unity in struggle with people who are not communists. Communists are obliged to work in common struggle in all areas of working class life. That's in the trade unions, on the housing question, fighting for care, fighting for decent pensions. We fight alongside the rest of the working class who's not yet drawn our ideas or not yet formulated a communist position. So there's no separation from communists from the rest of the class. We're there in the fight, in the fray. But what we do is we raise our ideas. We present our ideas. And politically, it's important that we have unity of communists in the same party, not entering into a political agreement on all aspects of politics with people who are not revolutionary socialists or communists. Because what happens in a broad left organization is inevitably that the communists are expected, and for the most part do, lower their banner and present the arguments of perhaps a radical leftist like Jeremy Corbyn. And therefore the communist arguments don't get put, or they're relegated. And you have people that will go along to one meeting and will organise for the left reformist programme to be presented and the candidate to get known and so on. And then on another occasion, they'll be out selling their Marxist papers. And the two, it's sort of almost like a political schizophrenia. What we need is unity of communists. In the same party, we need to create a mass communist party. And the reason is obvious. There's an unnecessary duplication of work. The different organizations in Britain at the moment are full of excellent communists. That includes the organizations, by the way, that call themselves socialist, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Socialist Party, Socialist Alternative. They are communists in the way that I mean the term communism, fighting for a society in which the working class comes to power and transforms the society from capitalism to communism. And we have a society in which ultimately we reach a society in which everybody contributes to their ability and everybody takes what they need. So the comrades in the Socialist Party, Socialist Alternative, what was Socialist Appeal and now is Revolutionary Communist Party, all of these comrades have the same basic ideas as I do. And I would think the same ideas as Mike has, and the same ideas as all of you have. And I think what is really necessary is a serious self-assessment or self-check, in a sense. Why is it that we're ploughing these different furrows, doing pretty much the same thing? We go to the protests on Gaza with very similar articles. We sell different papers with nearly the same mastheads. I just want to tell a story to finish with, because I'm not sure how long I've spoken for. But I was coming back from work. I live in Manchester, and as I think some of you know, I'm a barrister, and I was working in a trial in Liverpool. And yesterday I got the train back. And I was doing some preparation for the meeting that we've got on the Forging Communist Unity meeting with the comrades Mike and Jack from the CPGB and the comrades from Prometheus. So I had with me on the table, I was carrying this volume 24 of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and I was looking at various articles. I'd taken it with me to look at socialism, utopian and scientific. But in fact, I was a bit tired, so I was looking at quite a few other things, including the effect of the anti-socialist laws in Germany. But anyway, I had that on my desk, on my table, and as the train was diverted, And as I was getting up to get off at Victoria in Manchester, a young man leaned into me and under his breath he said, what's the explanation then? And I thought, this is a bit odd. Does he think there's some conspiracy theory about the train being diverted? And he said, and then he showed me in his hand, he had a copy of Lenin's State and Revolution. So I said, oh, right, okay. And so he said, what are you reading? Anyway, we ended up going for a coffee and we chatted for about an hour and a half. And the day before he'd read the Communist Manifesto, and yesterday he'd moved on to Lenin's State and Revolution. He'd never read anything before, but he thought that he ought to. And he agreed with what he'd been reading. He'd not come across any organization in his university, but he was really, really keen. He was a refugee who'd come to Britain from Syria in 2015, and he wanted to understand what Marxism was about. Now, that's just my one experience. I think that could be replicated 1 million times or 10 million times across the planet. But I then got to be thinking, if he goes on the internet and he's wanting to join, he's going to come up against a plethora of different organizations. He's going to see every single masthead that you can possibly imagine and some that you've never even heard of. How on earth does he decide? He's drawing the conclusion these Marxists want to organize society. They can't even get together and organize themselves. Most of the reasons for the separate organizations, in my opinion, do not justify separation. They just don't. The arguments that have led to the separation are mostly historic and are no longer that particularly relevant. They're of interest and they should be discussed out. A lot of it is to do with a lack of democracy and egos and the sort of staying in place of a leadership that doesn't want to lose its position, even if they've only got a membership of 6. And if you compare that to the task that we have, the challenge that we have, then it's lacking all sense of proportion and necessity as to what is required. We could pull together now, if the leadership of those other organizations desired, or the membership of those other organizations pressed their leadership to do, we could organize in a year's time a communist party or a socialist party with 4,000 or 5,000 members, in which there would be big disagreements. But the disagreements would be disagreements between communists. And that gives a different context to those disagreements than the ones we have with people who I would call reformist socialists. So what we need is a completely democratic communist party in which communists are allowed and encouraged to raise their ideas, to discuss their differences, to help clarify ideas, and organize around a program which is a guide to action for the party and for the class. We need it. It's urgent. And the discussions that we're having at the moment on a small scale are just a small step towards that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, comrade. Excellent start to the meeting. Very enthusiastic and inspiring. Thanks, comrade. I just wanted to say before I bring in Mike that the 3 organizations involved in the Communist Fusion process are also this year organizing together Communist University in central London, which will also be on Zoom, but much better to come along in real life and meet comrades and discuss how we can fuse together, how we can build as Nick says, a truly democratic organization. We don't want another communist party, do we? We'd rather bring the existing ones together. but actually most of the organizations that exist wouldn't touch this kind of process with the barge pole because, as Nick has explained, they don't allow differences to be aired publicly. They will have differences internally, but we're talking about an entirely different culture where you can have differences in the newspaper. You discuss them openly. You can have factions, open factions. We don't want factions, but you should have the right to have factions to allow those differences to be aired. So thank you very much, Nick, for that. That was excellent. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you, Nick. And I too agree with calling her May Day greetings, calling out May Day greetings to everybody across the world in struggle, and so on. I'm going to start with a slightly different angle, which is actually the why not, and why the why not is a lousy argument. Tony Greenstein, who I think probably quite a lot of comrades will know of because of his vigorous Palestine solidarity work and campaigning activity, writes in this week's Weekly Worker coming out, which is just out today, to cancel his subscription to the paper. And he's cancelling his subscription to the paper because of this Unity project, which he characterizes as sectarian and as quite rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic in circumstances where what is essential is to carry on a struggle to build a what he says a mass party of the left that is capable of resisting the growth of a mass racist party and a Labour Party that is indistinguishable politically from the Conservatives. I have to say, I think in terms of the Labour Party, it's the idea that the party is indistinguishable from the Conservatives is nonsense. It is distinguishable, otherwise, but it's nonetheless, it's not pursuing a policy which is in the interests of the working class. We are not, he says, Tony, we are not in a revolutionary or pre-revolutionary era, and therefore we shouldn't be pursuing, by inference, we shouldn't be pursuing revolutionary politics. We shouldn't be talking about dead Russians, dead Bolsheviks. And the Weekly Worker have turned their backs on the living political struggle in favour of an irrelevant unity project. The idea that revolutionaries, Marxists and reformists should unite in one mass party is rejected out of hand in favour of an unrealisable sectarian project. Okay, this is Tony's argument, and it's a very familiar argument. I've heard it many, many, many times. Actually, I heard it when I was young, when I was a member of the International Marxist Group. The Ross tendency argued the formulation which they had was that the Trotskyists need to have a, quote, priority united front axis towards the left social democratic organizing cadre, and should not be differentiating themselves from the Labour left or the official Communist Party on the issues of one sort and another. It's not actually, it's older than that. Okay, I went out this morning. I was supposed to be in central Oxford this morning, so I went out to vote in the county council elections, and I voted Tusk. I wasn't actually aware that Tusk was standing in my ward in the county council election. It was great. I had the opportunity to vote Tusk. Otherwise, I'd have had the unpalatable choice between Labour, the Greens, who are in coalition with the Lib Dems. The Labour and the Greens are the only people who actually put out any publicity in Oxford, or the Conservatives or Reform, or the, quote, Oxford Independent Alliance, which is actually a pro-car. It's a front for the Conservative Party, which it campaigns around against low traffic neighbourhoods. It's a on and off uncommon phenomenon for the Conservative Party, and it used to be the case Conservative working men's clubs were characterized as working men's non-political clubs. So whenever the Conservatives get into deep trouble, they rebrand themselves as independents of one sort or another. In a sense, reform is another exercise of the same sort, rebranding conservatism. In the general election, I would have had a wider choice. Oxford East, we had a Tusk candidate. We had a candidate for the Workers' Party of Britain, who in the end I voted for, in fact, on the basis that it was is purely of the anti-war character of the candidacy. And we had a candidate from the Workers' Revolutionary Party. And we had a candidate from the quote Corbynista Independents, an independent candidate who was left on the war but had no other non-Labour politics whatever. Now I could have added We Demand Change, the SWP's front organisation. And what this reflects is Tony's argument is the majority view of the British left, that there can be no unity of the far left unless it is unity with the loyalist left, with the quote, the reformists, unquote. I'm going to be a bit cautious about reformists because actually the extent to which people are actually advocating for reforms as opposed to just advocating for less bad, holding off, slowing down the process of the taking away of the working classes gains is very limited. So precisely the left groups are not prepared to unify among themselves unless we've got Corbyn on board or unless we've got a trade union leader on board, which was the idea behind Tusk, that we get the Rail Maritime Transport Union on board and a few other of the smaller unions. We can't unify. In order to the left, it's a waste of time. Anything is sectarian unless it's unity with the official lefts. And in order to be unity with the official lefts, it has to be unity with the official lefts on the basis of a diplomatic platform that, for example, we demand tax the rich to pay for the crisis in the NHS. Trouble with this, actually, the British state does tax the rich. It just keeps the tax rate low enough that it attracts, it operates as a tax haven. And it does tax at a very heavy rate the actual lawyers and accountants and bankers whose jobs are in the City of London. They're highly taxed. And in fact, that high, it's that income tax on the city is something like 25% of the total tax take. Income tax on the high salaries in the city, something like 25% of the total tax take, which is then redistributed to pay for the NHS and an awful lot of jobs of one sort and another. So tax the rich is trying to get around the fact that actually, in order to overcome the crisis of the NHS, we need planning in kind. We need to think about what the material resources are and how those material resources can be planned to make the society work. Okay, so the idea of the far left is that it's sectarian to try and unite the far left without previously uniting with the reformist left. And then the consequence is that each of them has their own separate project. Tusk, We Demand Change. And indeed, even in the trade union movement, we've got the Socialist Party's National Shop Stewards Network. I can't remember what the SWP's version was. Another group has got Troublemakers at Work Network. Each has their own broad front. The consequence of broad frontism is that everybody has their own broad front. Has this resulted in this project resulted in actually creating effective reformist parties? I suppose Tony's right. Revolution is not on the agenda, and therefore we shouldn't be promoting revolutionary politics. Is this non-promotion of revolutionary politics actually producing effective reformist politics? No, it bloody isn't. Workers' Party of Brazil collapses, starts out as a vigorous reformist party, but collapses into the game of Brazilian coalition clientelism. Refundazione Comunista enters into coalition with the left, with the Democratic Party and the centre ground, and is broken up over the question of Italian troops going into Afghanistan. Syriza forms a government together with the right-wing nationalists, and then unavoidably, once the civil servants actually brief them on the real economic situation of Greece, capitulate in face of the demands of the Troika, because Greece can't feed itself and has not been able to feed itself without food imports since the 5th century BCE. Podemos again enters into coalition, is defeated. Corbynism, the first phase of Corbynism, it appears as a radical alternative, and because it appears as a radical alternative, doesn't quite win a majority, but wins takes away Theresa May's majority. The result of that oppositional character of Corbynism is a major concession by the judiciary, that the House of Lords, that the Supreme Court, in unison against the Lord Chancellor, overthrows Vince Cable's wizard wheeze of driving up tribunal fees so high as to prevent the enforcement of labour law. That's a big concession. It's a big concession organised by the judiciary, and going along with that, we get a whole load of Tory social thought of one sort and another. But then, of course, the Corbynistas are persuaded into, well, we've done so well, if we can just defeat the government in Parliament, we'll be able to force a general election which we win. And then, in consequence, they give Keir Starmer, as Shadow Minister for Europe, his head to play games with the Tory Remainers. So the Labour Party votes for Tory Remainer motions. The Tory Remainers never vote for Labour Party motions. By 2019, the Labour Party has tagged itself in a way in which it wasn't in 2017 as the party which tries to overthrow Brexit by dishonest manoeuvres in Parliament. And Boris Johnson is able to cash that and smash Corbynism. So that none of these projects of unity of reformists and revolutionaries work. And it hasn't worked. It goes back earlier than that. It was already failed policy. It was already a failed policy when it was the policy of Ernest Mandel in the left wing of the Belgian Socialist Party in the early 1960s. It was already a failed policy when it was the policy of Raymond Molinier and Pierre Franck in the La Commune tendency, which counterposed itself to the Trotskyists on the basis of building a broad front opposition in the French Socialist Party in the 1930s, and then in the Parti Socialiste Ouvrier Paysan in 1938 to 1940. All along, this is a policy which has failed and failed and failed and failed. And it's not just that it fails to build a revolutionary organization, which is it fails to build a reformist organization either. It's no guarantee, there's no guarantee of victory by unifying the left on the basis of Marxism. It's a guarantee of failure to keep on with the project of attempting to construct broad fronts. There is a chance that by unifying the left on the basis of Marxism, we could create, it's not on the agenda right now to have hundreds of thousands of people in a communist party, but it is on the agenda right now, if we could break through Socialist Party, Socialist Workers' Party, Revolutionary Communist Party, to break through to a communist party on the scale of the old CPGB at its height, which would be a force operating in relation to a real influence on the Labour left, as opposed to a mere tail for the Labour left, which the reality is that the left groups operating in the Labour Party. Secondly, I just and very briefly, because I'm coming to the end of my time, the difference, talking of the difference in terms of reformist versus revolutionary, is somewhat misleading. And the reason is because what our opponents is loyal to the British nation and the British state and the British Constitution. And that loyalty to the British nation and the British state becomes the vehicle by which, for example, the Corbynistas, the second wing of the British government's assault on the Corbynistas, is the anti-Semitism witch hunt. But the anti-Semitism witch hunt is in reality a demand for loyalty to the British state. In reality, it's a demand for loyalty to the United States in relation to the United States' colonial possession, Israel. United States settler colony in Israel. Yes, it's true that it wasn't originally United States settler colony, but then New York was not originally a British settler colony. Israel became a United States settler colony. So it's the call that the anti-Semitism witch hunt was a demand for loyalty to the United States and for statements of loyalty to the United States. Similarly in relation to NATO, similarly today in relation to Ukraine. And this is not, again, ancient history, but in reality, the left wing of the difference between the communist movement and the socialist movement, socialist parties, communist parties and the socialist parties, starts with the German social democracy with August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht refusing to vote war credits for the German war German war with France in 1870, and then the left of the SPD, German Socialist Party, refusing to support Eduard Bernstein's arguments for support for humanitarian intervention in Armenia in defense of Christians against the Ottoman Empire in the 1890s. And in this country, Ernest Belfort backs Theodore Rothstein's opposition to Henry Hyndman's British nationalism, and the difference between the big split of 1914. But the reality is that's not that big split of 1914. That's not about dead and gone politics. It's about a live question. Do you back your own state in relation to its national interests? And do you back your own state in its imperialist operations and its wars? And that live question is the question which blew up Rifondazione in Italy. It's the question, in essence, in a different form, which destroyed Syriza, the politics of single national roads to socialism and single country socialism. So that my point in all this, there are live political differences between the right wing of the workers' movement and its left those live political differences actually at present have the consequence that the centre right, the part of the left of the movement which clings to unity with the right, the loyalist left wing, like the Corbynistas, are incapable of organising effectively and in the long term. There is a chance, a small chance, that unity of the revolutionary left, the disloyalist left, the left which seeks to overthrow capitalism altogether, which seeks radical democracy, which seeks a break with imperialism, that unity of that left could possibly change something. We recognize what we're doing with this forging communist unity process. It's bleeding small groups. It's really small groups. But if we make a go of it, maybe we can project a future for the left as a whole. That's it.
Thank you very much, comrade. Anybody who's got a question or wants to make a contribution, please click raise hand. Just want to ask you, comrades, a couple of questions. Starting with you, Mike, from what you were just saying. You're saying this process of pretending, for the revolutionary left to pretend they're not revolutionaries really, and seeking unity with the right. In We Demand Better, it's actually now the Green Party, which we have to get on board. We had a organizing meeting in Sheffield, which was terrible. They want to debate with the Green Party what kind of electoral challenge, but no other organization that's standing. So they're giving them a platform against reform, etc. So because they can't do it with the Labour Party anymore, with the Labour left, it's now moved on to the Green Party. But from their perspective, you're saying it's not working. But from the perspective of a group like the SWP or the Socialist Party, I mean, they think they're it, aren't they? They think they are the kernel, they're it already. We just have to get to a revolutionary situation, and then the little group will become massive and attract masses of people. I mean, does it not work for them on that level?
Okay, the reality in terms of the British far left, at the end of the Second World War, there was an organization called the Revolutionary Communist Party, which was the biggest Trotskyist organization which had then existed. It had 200 members. It split into roughly three parts, the biggest of which was Jerry Healy's organization called the Club, which became the Workers' Revolutionary Party, Socialist Labour League, and then the Workers' Revolutionary Party. The second biggest was the Cliff faction, which became the International Socialists and then the Socialist Workers' Party. And the third biggest was the Grant faction, which became the Militant. And now out of the Militant comes the Socialist Party and the Revolutionary Communist Party Mark III, I think it is. And because in the interim we had the Revolutionary Communist Party Mark II of Yaffe and Frank Furedi and co. But in essence, in terms of the size of the organisations of the British far left, it is the only extent to which things have changed and overtaken is that the WRP blew up and reduced itself to fragments, and the IMG, which was a rather smaller organisation all along, at the same period blew up and reduced itself to fragments. The SWP is in the 2,500 to 3,000 actual paid up members. SPEW, Socialist Party of England and Wales, about 1,000 odd, probably a bit less paid up members. Revolutionary Communist Party claims 1,000, but whether that's genuine is very questionable from the point of view of deployable forces and pictures of meetings and stuff like that. But these organizations are bigger because every forward movement, rising tide lifts all boats. Rising tide does not marginalize. Rising tide of class struggle does not have the effect of marginalizing existing forces. And even that's true even in terms of revolutions. Portuguese Revolution turned the Portuguese Socialist Party into a very large mass party. The Portuguese Communist Party, which had been slightly stronger than the Portuguese Socialist Party, also grew on a very large, in clandestinity, also grew on a very large scale. Maoist groups, Trotskyist groups also grew. None of them outpaced the other. None of them became, this is the decisive body. Mm-hmm. The Bolshevik Party in Russia, okay, I know comrades don't want us to talk about Russia, but the Bolshevik Party in Russia was the majority party of the Russian working class as of 1912 to 1914. It was the party which held all the working class constituencies in the Duma. It was a party whose daily newspaper had mass circulation. The Trotskyists, but partly because Trotsky refused to recognize that in 1912, but also because the Trotskyists want to believe that you can start with a few thousand and a revolutionary situation, turn it around and take power. It's delusional. Where we're at is fragments which we have to somehow overcome in order to get to the point of being able to construct a party which can sink deep roots. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. Nick, before I open the floor, one question to you. The title of the meeting was why we're fighting for a mass communist party, and you've answered it as well. Also, but how we're doing it. And I know there have been meetings going on between the three groups for some time, and on both websites and in the Weekly Worker, there are reports about that. But perhaps you could sort of give your impression of how it's going, maybe, and where it's going, and where there are challenges, and how you think we might be able to overcome them. I mean, obviously, one thing I've mentioned already is Communist University taking place this year, organized by all three groups together, and being in the same room with members of organizations like that, I think will go some way to, clarify where we disagree, perhaps, but also bring us together on a social level. We'll meet in the evenings, etc. And I think that kind of aspect, talking together outside of meetings is really important. What do you think about how it's going?
How long have I got? I'm not aware of it having been done in the recent past. So I've certainly got no experience of it. So how's it going? Well, the meetings are comradely. They're approached seriously by all parties. I think there's a real determination to make it work. I noticed, I mean, I read obviously the stuff in the Weekly Worker. I'm sure, well, I hope that they read the stuff that we write. And anybody that's following it will know that there are differences, and we've got to discuss those differences out, and we've got to find out through further discussion, are those differences that prevent us being in the same organization, or are those precisely the sort of differences that I was talking about, which should be contained within a joint organization? And I'm hoping very much that it's the latter. But we do have to get through all sorts of misunderstandings and being creditable. Sometimes I think perhaps there's not misunderstandings, and I have complained that my views or Ed's views haven't actually been properly reported. But hopefully we can correct that, and we can get past that. The Communist University, I hope, will be a success and an opportunity to discuss some of these ideas. Some of them are quite basic ideas, and I've used this metaphor before about Darwin's finches, that we've all grown up in different islands in the Galapagos, and we've all developed different colored tails to our feathers, and we squawk in different ways, and we use words in different ways, and so but we're all finches. We're all Marxists, we're all communists, and so there must be a way of getting around this. And I hope it was clear from my opening comments. I think this is so important that we really do need to make this work. We need to make it work so that we can show other people that it's possible. And if we can show that, even if we've got quite serious differences on some issues, so long as they are within what we think are the sort of broad parameters of what is a communist party, then let's have those ideas out and discuss them in front of people that are watching. And some of those discussions might be quite difficult. They might be quite theoretical. Try to make them as accessible as possible. We shouldn't underestimate the ability of people to follow them, to read. I want to develop it because I know people are watching. We're getting emails from people who are saying we're watching this, and we're interested, and we hope it works. I'm assuming, well, some of them say it, but I'm assuming that those others who write to us are watching and hoping that it produces something that is attractive and that they want to join. So, we still got a lot of discussion to go, because we've got to make sure that we generally agree, that we understand where we don't agree, but we've also got to be content that if we go into an organization, it's the sort of organization in which, notwithstanding all the promises and this, that, and the other about democracy and accommodating differences and so on, that it's a healthy culture. And I think for a lot of people who have been through the existing left, or who have watched the existing left and pulled their hair out at the rivalry between the existing left, that's a big concern. And I think we've not yet discussed it, but I think it's something that we've got to address. It's one thing saying we want a healthy democratic culture. It's another thing actually making sure that you deliver it. And that's going to be a litmus test. And so I think the way that we conduct our debates internally or in the Forging Communist Unity at the Communist University is important. But I'll say this, and maybe Mike and Jack and others in the CPGB will take issue with this. I think we've also got to think about the way that we relate to other people who are in the communist movement, who we say that we want to merge with, we want to be in the same party with. It's one thing having sharp differences. It's another about how you go about expressing those sharp differences. Because if you say, well, I agree with you, but I've got the differences over this. But if you do that and they're a comrade, then you can overcome it. If you treat them like idiots and, are useless to the working class struggle, then it's more difficult for the unity to progress. I do want, if I can, just a couple of minutes. This business about we shouldn't discuss revolutionary politics in a non-revolutionary situation is one of the most alarmingly ridiculous arguments that one can envisage, because the main work, in my opinion, is not what the working class will do in power. It's making sure that the working class comes to power. And it can only come to power if it understands the task of coming to power and what it needs to do in power. And you can't do that in 3 weeks or 3 months. You can't even do it in 3 years. I agree with the point that Mike made about the Bolshevik Party. They were the mass party of the Russian working class. We're nowhere near that. How are we going to get to that? That's the question. How do we become? I've been following some of the comments, and I agree with quite a few of. I haven't had a chance to read them all, but Ant says I agreed with what Ant's written in his two longer pieces, but one of them he says developing class consciousness isn't as easy as I was suggesting. I hope I wasn't suggesting that it was easy, but the point is, if we don't try to raise the consciousness, we will never do it. And that means if we succumb or subordinate our energy, our enthusiasm to building support for some vague peace and justice program, we will never enthuse people about communism. I am sure that most of the comrades in the SWP would be more enthusiastic about standing a candidate of their own and arguing revolutionary politics on the doorstep than they will be talking to the Green Party and backing some wishy-washy Green. Anyway, I'm going to stop there for now because I know I've spoken. Yeah.
Thanks, Nick. Yep, very good. Soraya, please.
Comradely May Day greetings. I have to say I've always been stupefied that the ruling class in the UK can't even tolerate May Day being celebrated with an official holiday on the day itself, to sort of distance. I don't know the history of that, but I'm sure somebody will be able to lecture me on it. My starting point is, which is the agent in society which is capable of overthrowing capitalism? And I hope we all agree in this meeting that it's the working class. And by that, I mean those who have to sell their labour to survive, the vast majority of society. And the overthrowing capitalism will not be achieved by a spontaneous or automatic movement. Now, that's not to say there won't be spontaneous movements which are either or both of those things, but without a mass communist party to organise and to lead and to channel, as it were, that movement, which inevitably will come, it will, as we've seen in history, be doomed to failure. So I think it's an essential question. How do we get then to that mass communist party? As Nick said, the communists who already exist, and there are many, I don't think we are unique in this meeting. I certainly hope not, or else we're going to have a very difficult battle, but being facetious there. But they should be in one organisation, and that's the aim of these. The starting point of that is these discussions. That's how I see it. It's not that a few groups, small, tiny groups, will become the mass communist party, but it's we need to start somewhere, and we need to build a beacon for others as an attempt, a contribution to a starting point for that endeavour. And there's so many people out there, so many people who have been in organisations, have been demoralised about the lack of democracy, the methods of discussion, and who've not changed their views. They've not stopped being communists, but there isn't anything to go into, and so and then there are people who've not been in anything, but who have, of course, again, because we're not some sort of superior beings, unique in the world, who suddenly know what the answer is and nobody else can understand that there's got to be an alternative. It's reaching those people, attempting to reach those people, and again, my view is that there's no alternative but to take these steps. Now that means, again, for me, approaching others in a comradely way, not as superiors and, oh, you can come to us because we know. It's just that we have different starting points, and for various reasons we're not all united, but we want to be. And it may be we don't agree with and I think the various groups that have been named, on a personal level, I may not agree with some of their leaders or the lack of democracy, but there are excellent members. And I think that it's so important, the approach that we have, that we don't, I don't like, some groups have a habit of denigrating anybody else and that they have the one true word. And I can understand the psychology of that, because those who have been fighting for communism for decades have been isolated in society and attacked and lambasted in the media and so forth. And so there's a sort of bunker mentality. But that doesn't mean that we should adopt that approach. And I'm not suggesting anybody here would do, but that we approach comrades with, and I call them comrades, with respect, and not with a reluctance. Oh, well, we've got to do this because, you know, I'm not very, very keen on this group or that group. It's with enthusiasm, because we want to be an attractive force, and so that there is a pole of attraction for those looking for an alternative that we all desperately need. So I'm enthusiastic. I'm not exaggerating what we can achieve at this stage, but I'm very enthusiastic about the steps, and that, as Nick said, that there are people watching, and hopefully who will also be attracted, and that we will achieve a beginning of a unity, as I said, of the existing people from the existing groups, but also those who aren't in any at all. Thank you.
Thanks, Soraya. Rafal, you are up next. I think your camera doesn't work, but we can hear you.
Hello. Firstly, I'd like to extend comradely greetings on this 1st of May to everyone. And secondly, my question would be following on pretty much from what Soraya just contributed, which is the question of how do we approach the existing left? So obviously the forging communist unity process is still in, let's say, early stages with no guarantee of success. But if we are optimistic, let us say that the current fusion is successful. How then are the sects approached? Because obviously, you know, it's important to have enthusiasm and be optimistic and comradely towards our fellow communists, but it would be disingenuous to act as if many of us don't already have certain a predisposition towards these groups as, you know, undemocratic, as sectarian, as belonging to tendencies holding views that are absolutely red lines to many of us. So how much good faith should be extended in trying to build a mass communist party from the existing parties? How much effort into formal unity, merger talks, and so on, which, you know, in a worst case scenario are open to the sort of, you know, the Zinovievite bureaucratic methods of manipulations and all sorts of nastiness, trying to exclude factions and you know, corrupt the process of building a pluralistic democratic communist party? And how much effort into, you know, trying to build a sort of communist party united front from below, and just drawing the memberships of those parties and hoping that they will, you know, good communists from, say, you know, the RCP, the SWP, what have you, CPG-BML even, will flock to the banner of a better communist party. I'm interested in hearing what both panelists have to say on that topic. Thank you.
Interesting question. Thanks, Rafal. Mike and Nick, we've got two more people with a hand up. Shall I take them first?
It would be useful, I think, given that we've had several contributions, to come in response to what we've had so far, and then see what we get further beyond that. I don't know if Nick agrees with me on that.
I don't mind.
Go on then, Mike, you start.
Okay. Nick, you said you haven't been involved in fusion processes before. I have, in the International Socialist Group, which was created out of a fusion in the first place between the international group, which split off from the international Marxist group, and then a couple of other fragments of the IMG, together with the briefing group of Graham Bash and others, and the Socialist Labour Group, which was the Lombartiste, the organisation in Britain of the Organising Committee for the Reconstruction of the Fourth International, and the Socialist Group of Alan Thornett and others, who split with Matt Gamner over the question of the Malvinas War and Ireland. The problem with this, in my experience, was that the fusion was founded on the basis of diplomacy, and it was founded on the basis of a supposed common commitment to entry in the Labour Party as a principle. And very rapidly afterwards, the diplomacy broke down. The apparent agreements turn out made in a diplomatic way turn out not to be real agreements, and the various groups splintered off, and the ISG, by the time I left it in the early 1990s, had reduced from its 200 odd at the start to very substantially less. And in fact, the ISG has gone through at least 2 similar fusions on the basis of diplomatic agreements around tactics, since I haven't been in the organisation at that time, but first with comrades around respect renewal, and then subsequently with the group which they're now in, with Neil Faulkner's group, who came out of Counterfire, and I can't remember what they called themselves. But this is something which the USEC organizations, the Mandelite organizations, have done over and over and over again, so that I'm familiar with it. Equally, the Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste, big project, but based on this method of diplomatic agreement rather than agreement on the basis that you form agreement, you unite a party on the basis of a program and not on the basis of tactics, and unite a party on the basis that there are openly understood disagreements among the different sides of the party, rather than diplomatic formulations. That, I think, is fairly fundamental. There are things which are we don't understand each other things. So Jack Conrad's piece on Peter Taff, I, coming from a Trotskyist background, I think that Jack, coming from what was originally an official communist background, doesn't actually quite understand the nature of the debates inside Trotskyism at a number of points in relation to his account of the history of the how the RCP, the Grant faction of the RCP, evolved into the militant, and that's because of the concept. Well, part of it is the concept of, quote, deep entryism, which is a part of the Healy Cannon Lambert polemic against the Frank Lawrence, etc. Tendencies. In any case, my point is simply that there are aspects where I think I have a better understanding of the history of Trotskyism than Jack does, because I come out of the Trotskyist movement, and terminological issues, which we have. Part of what we've been discussing in our Forging Communist Unity discussions is terminological issues. What do we use? What do we mean when we use the word, quote, socialism? Or for that matter, what do we mean when we use the word dictatorship of the proletariat? And there is an issue about, in this case, about terminological issues. In my view, also, there's an issue about what do we mean by, quote, socialism, negative side. What do we mean by, quote, socialism in one country? At the same time, I think we have to get, and I think the point that somebody made, that and I think made that class struggle is more difficult. Class consciousness is more difficult. The reason why class consciousness is more difficult is because we've gone through Stalinism. And we are, in a sense, in a historical situation analogous to the situation of bourgeois revolutionaries of the 1400s and 1500s, when there was an absolute dominance of monarchism because of the failure of the Italian city-states. And it was not until an alternative model of capitalist rule in the shape of the Netherlands and Britain came through that it was possible to overcome that. And our kids today are taught in school Shakespeare is part of that ideological offensive of city republicanism leads to tyranny and only monarchy can possibly save the world. It's still taught because it's part of the foundations of Tory ideology. But that means that has the consequence that we have to have that degree of consciousness that there's a weight which lays down on the workers' movement and on class consciousness, which is the weight of Stalinism. This inevitably leads to Stalinism, which every school child is taught at GCSE level. Relating to that, Zinoviev, Rafal referred to, I think that's a misleading concept. The reason why it's a misleading concept is because Lenin and Trotsky were party to the wrong decisions which were taken. That Grigory Zinoviev, it's a piece of negative cult of the personality. We want to blame Grigory Zinoviev in order to avoid blaming Lenin and Trotsky for decisions that they were party to in 1920-21. And finally, in relation to civility, the problem with civility is that the danger of it is it becomes deference. Because it's always the case that somebody who disagrees sharply with the majority point of view is normally likely to be accused of rudeness. In fact, we saw this very strongly in the Corbynista period, that the Corbynistas were accused of bullying the Labour right-wingers. The Labour right-wingers were fucking in control. And the call for respect and civility can be too easily, it becomes, you can't sharply express minority positions. You have to engage in deference. I find this. I've been reading masses of stuff about the trans question, and the left, the academic and Euro-communist left in this context is Foucaultian. And everybody who wants to say anything disagreeing has to give a hat tip to Foucault, has to give a hat tip to, of course, I'm against class reductionism. But by saying I give a hat tip to Foucault, of course, I'm against class reductionism, actually, you've immediately conceded the fundamental arguments of neoliberalism. And that aspect, and the left is doing it as well, comrades in the SWP and RS21 in socialist resistance, anti-capitalist resistance, sorry, are doing the same thing. So I want to be cautious about the issue of rudeness and civility, simply because it's too commonly the case that charges of rudeness and incivility are just charges of failing to give sufficient deference to majority opinion. That's it.
Nick.
Okay, so in terms of Rafal's question, how do we approach the existing left? Well, first of all, the existing left must know that these talks are going on, and I can, because I've been in the room, I know exactly what's being said. These pifflers on the fringes of the labour movement That's what the people in the leading offices will be saying. And they won't want to touch us. They'll ignore us. They'll poo-poo us. They'll ridicule us. They'll laugh at us. But we have to just bang the drum for communist unity. We have to put propaganda out there. My article in the TAS website was sort of drawing a sort of a pyramid. And I was saying we need working class unity. And so therefore we need to overcome the differences that are introduced into the working class by alien class forces, the ideas of nationalism, of racism, of sexism, of homophobia and hostility to trans people. It's introduced to weaken the working class. And the working class needs to overcome that. And I think on the left, I think it's also on the Marxist left, anybody who's serious must ask themselves a question. I just read an article in this paper. It was actually quite good. They said the same thing as we said 2 weeks ago. And so it's propaganda. We need to put out the arguments for communism because they're not put out generally. We need to put out the propaganda for Marxist and communist unity because nobody else is doing it. So that's the first thing. Now, it may be that just goes into the ether and it doesn't, but I don't think that's going to be the case. I think it will be picked up and I think it will have an effect. And there are people already, you know, the ones and twos, nobody wants to exaggerate this and blow things out of proportion, but people are watching. So if we pull this off, and that's a big if still, I mean, let's not get carried away. It's going to take some time. And I wouldn't want to misrepresent, what's going to be achieved in the short term. We need to, carry on. But if we succeed, I think that it would draw into that organization a layer of serious people who have been watching. And we would need to keep those people. And that's why the internal culture is so important, the democracy and the way we talk to one another and so on. And those people would gravitate towards us. And that in itself will have a big impact. On Ant's question, I don't necessarily, well, I actually agree with Mike's position on this question of class consciousness. I'm just going to make a point and then come back. On this question of class consciousness, the weight of Stalinism, I think, is an absolute massive glacial boulder. And that's why in the discussions that we've been having, me and Ed have been trying to emphasize that. I take issue with what Mike's written about us wanting moral distance from Stalinism. We want a political difference and distinguishment from Stalinism. We need to make it clear, in my opinion, that the communism that we aspire to has nothing to do with the communism in the Soviet Union or the communism in the Chinese Communist Party or in North Korea for that matter. So that weight, we've got to challenge it and we've got to go out of our way to challenge it. But if we do get some sort of small unity, I think there's the possibility of a positive dialectical development here, because it would be the coming together of people who've got shared ideas, differences, but shared ideas. It could attract a new layer of people, and that could create a sort of effect. Who knows? Again, I don't want to get carried away. If you look at, I know there's been an interesting discussion on Y Marx about the Gotha fusion, the German SPD, and whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, but certainly it did create a snowball effect. I'd probably be with Marx and opposed it, but there we go. It was a good thing in the sense that it created this snowball. So one of the articles that I was reading on the train when that young man approached me was about the impact of the anti-socialist laws that were introduced by Bismarck in 1880, just 5 years after the unification at Gotha. And I'm not trying to draw parallels with what we're doing, but with the Gotha program, it's just to make a point that the unification had this snowball effect, such that Bismarck was forced to introduce legislation to ban the SPD, and suppress it. And Engels, in this article from volume 24, he says, in the year from 1879 to October 1880, there were in Prussia alone 11,202 political prisoners, socialists who'd been arrested for their involvement in socialist activity. So it obviously had an effect. Now, we could start putting out material saying, look, we've taken this small step, we want to discuss with others. There are all sorts of tactics that we could do. We could put to the SP and the SWP and the RCP, instead of doing your "we want change," instead of you going into collective, instead of you going into Tusk and standing on a non-communist program, why don't we decide collectively to stand in 20 seats and have not like a socialist alliance that we had in the 2000s, but a communist platform? I don't know. There's all sorts of things that we could discuss to try to build the idea of unity. On Raphael's particular points, we have to make the argument and see what happens. And we shouldn't be afraid of making criticisms and pointing out things that we don't agree with. If these organizations were more democratic, then I think, you know, we may all be members of them. Why not? If there was the right for us to argue our ideas, our brand of communism inside the RCP, why would we not be in the RCP? It's only because they have this non-factional permission. You know, they don't allow the organization of different ideas. They don't tolerate anything different. You almost have to genuflect before everything that Trotsky said in order to be a member, which I couldn't live with. In TAS, we're a small organization, very small, but we've got people from all sorts of different backgrounds, different traditions, and we've got differences. We've got differences over words and terminology and assessment, and hopefully we'll have a comradely discussion to tease out those differences and work out what we actually stand for. And then, so that just leads me on to the last 2 points. Unification. I don't know whether I like the use of the sort of denigratory adjective of it's diplomatic or diplomacy. I don't see anything wrong myself with being diplomatic. There's ways of presenting one's arguments which are clearly, I don't agree with you. And a lot of discussions can be started by the fact, I don't agree with you on this. And the reasons I don't agree with you are these, and you set them out. In Jack's article, Ed and I are accused of being Proudhonists, Bakuinists, Stalin 1929ists, Pol Potists, and being strategically dumb. So, look, we can swallow that. I've got a thick skin. I think Ed has as well. But personally, I don't think it helps. Internally, the question of rudeness, I don't think there's any excuse for it. And I want a party where if somebody is rude, then they're called out for it. And if it's a leader who is rude, they're put in their place. Because I think that rudeness actually is used to cow members and basically subordinate them. And I don't want to be in an organization where anybody thinks like that or feels that they can't say something because if they make a mistake, they'll be jumped on. And so I think leaders have to go out of their way, particularly when there are differences, to say, we welcome your difference. It's a good point you're making, but we disagree with you for this reason. And therefore, it may be that Mike doesn't disagree with anything I've just said, but you know, these are things that we've got to discuss, and it'll be part of the fusion process. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that'd be a difference, but an interesting one. Andy, and then who else have we got? Jake, and then Sachin.
Okay, I'll keep my points brief. Happy May Day, everyone. And thank you also to Mike and Nick for an interesting discussion so far. I'm just going to dive into the issue around civility. I might regret it. I must admit, it's a difficult one. In that, quite clearly, those of us who've experienced the Labour Party or been in other organisations which are bureaucratic and dominated by a bureaucracy understand how the right wing and those people who already have power within those organisations will use accusations of rudeness or even bullying in order to silence their critics. I saw it very often, very clearly in my local Labour Party. And, I have concerns then around attempts to police how people express themselves and how they debate ideas. We are all, if we are communists, we have a huge ambitious project, which I'm presuming we're all very passionate about. We're talking about the liberation of humanity. And actually, what I found interesting, Nick, is you raised this issue of civility earlier, and you then went on to describe those people who believe that you can't put revolutionary ideas in front of the class during non-revolutionary periods as being utterly ridiculous. Now, it could be argued that that was rude, and actually you should have used more kind of civil language in doing that, but you were passionate about it and it came across. And I certainly think you were right to do it, and actually it is utterly ridiculous. So I'm with you on that. I'm not with you on the idea of the need to police people's speech. Having said that, you do look at the history of Stalinist organizations and Trotskyist organizations, the WRP, etc., and you see, individuals within those parties being bullied by the leadership and being cowed. And this is a cultural issue. It's not something you can draw up in rules, in my view. It's about the right of ordinary members to challenge. Like I say, that means that ordinary members can be challenging and maybe rather blunt in how they approach things. It's about how we develop people in the lower ranks of the organization and whatever comes out of it in order to hold leaderships to account. It's another reason why I do support a minimum maximum program, because you can hold leaderships to account. But yeah, so we all clearly have differences around that. Two more things with the indulgence of the chair. I'd be quite interested to hear from Mike. You mentioned how the RCP Mark I split up into 3 different factions. My question to you is, are there anything coming out of that, that kind of, the breaking up of that organization, which would be useful to us in this process? What are the dangers? What led to those 3 organizations coming out of the RCP? Like I say, is there anything we can learn? And then finally, my question is, because I'm going to be at Communist University, and I'd be interested to know, do we have any sessions organized? How prominent will this discussions around this particular process feature in the Communist University itself? I'll leave it there. Thank you, Colin.
I can answer that one quickly because I'm involved in that. We are getting there. There's a few roundtables being planned, but it's actually down to the 3 groups as well to decide which issues they think we have to discuss in a roundtable and which might be just better discussed with one particular person doing an opening. But we're getting there. Thanks, Andy. Okay, Jake, please.
Hi, happy May Day, comrades. I just think it's worth emphasizing that I don't think we should be too over-modest about the unification process. Otherwise, we might end up underestimating the importance of a success of an initiative like this. It is tiny forces, and I think it's good to be honest about that. But there might be people outside of the participating organizations that choose to join. And I think 50 people working together, instead of 5 lots of 10, it's not just 5 times as good. It's a non-linear thing, so 50 people is a lot better, and that's kind of part of this snowball effect. The initial kind of building up of these forces makes a huge difference. And then I think there's a bit of a false dilemma that goes around sometimes around the sects, which goes something like either we have to have a broad front or we have to have complete and total unity with the sects, which we can't possibly imagine. And I just don't think that's what we're facing. Like a unity initiative like this could peel off factions or whatever from some of these other groups. No, not necessarily straight into whatever organization views out of this, but you win over people in these other organizations, factions develop, you come into, you start doing joint work with them. Maybe you host events together and do joint publications, have chats, and this trust builds up over time. And then, you can't predict exactly how this is all going to go, but this kind of false dilemma of there's no way we're going to unify with the SWP in the next 2 years as like a complete and total thing. So, broad frontism is more realistic. I just don't see that as the way it is. And that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Jake. Danny, you've got your hand up. Do you want to speak? Then please unmute yourself and switch on your camera. Oh, there you are. Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in briefly. It's not any great insight really, but but to me, in terms of rudeness and culture, the two biggest obstacles I have when I talk about communist unity, if you like, with people who are new to this sort of politics, is the experience of Stalinism and the misuse of power. And with people who are familiar, old hands like myself, it's the experience of being in organizations where you experienced misuse of power. So, language, being rude to people, calling each other names, I think it's really, really off-putting. It's not about policing people and saying, you can't have frank and honest debate, which I think we're having. It is about, though, treating each other as comrades and showing a degree of discipline, to be honest with you, as well as the embryonic kind of communist society that we'd like to be in. I think for me, I am a secret weekly worker reader. I have been for many years. I like the openness. I like the transparency. I don't like the name calling. I don't like people sometimes, for me, not being very reflective on how they're coming across. And if I was going to be more involved in a process like this, certainly I'd want to be treating other people with respect as comrades and experiencing that myself. So that's all I'd really like to say to this. It's a really positive development, and that's why I'm here, because I'm interested in it. But this would be my contribution and thoughts.
Thanks, Danny. You're not a secret weekly worker reader anymore. We all know it now. Sachin.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah. I'll probably start with that really. I mean, like for myself, I take a leaf out of Chris Knight's work here, and I think to openly ridicule and to laugh at is a good and a healthy thing. And I know one of the arguments there, perhaps by Nick, is, and I think Danny followed up on that, is of leaders and stuff. But one of the ways then, right, leaders, and then there's power relations. One of the ways to keep them into account is by openly ridiculing, not, swearing, laughing, ganging up on them. I think it's a healthy thing, really, and especially if one of the thoughts is of a party of leaders, because one of the things that's been talked about is the working class coming to power. I liked Soraya's what Soraya was saying there, and in my head I was thinking, okay, well, why the working class? And I just wrote two words down: universal class. And the key will be to develop an organization that is basically at the head of the class as a whole, as itself. I'll just try to be articulate and just say a couple of words. Cultural warfare, right? We need to go through the existing left. One of the reasons that we need to go through the existing left is I think where Mike was talking about the RCP, and then he talks about, well, Mandel, Cliff, Grant, and then the existing left continues to proliferate. And as long as they are there and in their current forms, not in a culturally evolved form, because I found the idea of the finches quite interesting, because the idea of the finches, though, is okay, we can class them all as finches, but they've got to a stage in their biological development where they are unable to actually produce live young with each other to create something, like something biologically that can exist. And the sex are a little bit like that as well. And one of the challenges, and I was enthusiastic about some of the things that Mike was saying, and well, have you read us? I think Nick was saying, Mike was like, yes, I am. I am. I don't know if you saw the camera there. It's just like, yes, I am. Yes, of course. And what, in terms of then the words cultural warfare, then I think one of the changes that needs to develop is that external differences are okay. And external differences to other people, external differences, talking outside of an organization, but with what's going on within the organization. But of course, need unity in action. That's the essence of, in my head, what democratic centralism is about. And then when an action has been called, then everybody just like, for that action anyway, all right, shut the fuck up, let's get the job done, let's get it done, and we can criticize afterwards, but we just need to get the job done. The thing with like the sect mentality is that it's almost, the action is permanent. The action is that we've got this group right now, and then this group will eventually lead the working class into revolution. Because then the action becomes permanent, then it is like, like internally, you'll have grumbles or whatever, but then externally, no, we need to show the world this solid front, and that's the thing that needs to be overcome, I think, for momentum and movement. And I know people have said, oh, we need this many members, we need that many members. This will cause a snowball effect. So like in my some sort of positive feedback or negative feedback.
Can you wind up
effect.
now, comrade? Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I'll just say a couple more words here. So the finches, they're biologically, there's no going back, but we are all human. Culturally, we can change. So let's go back to, and also look at the world before the renegade Kautsky. and look back at Kautsky and yeah. Okay. So
Okay, thank you, Sachin.
thank you.
We've got William wants to speak briefly, but I should say we want to give at least 5 minutes each to the main speakers. So if you could do a couple of minutes, William, that would be great.
Yeah, I have not a lot to say this week, except that I wish you luck with your communist university, but I don't think I could attend. I would say now I would have a headache for the rest of the year. And I've watched sectarianism on the British left, especially the Trotskyite left, which I find absolutely despicable. So I'd say one thing for you is when you still have your ideological differences, you tend to be less violent than we do in Ireland. Differences with the Irish republicanism usually ends up with shooting and killing. Maybe we're a little bit more passionate than yours, but anyway, the best of luck to you. So I just thank you for allowing me even sit at your webinar.
Thanks, comrade. Okay, let's bring both main speakers then back in to sum up and perhaps try and find a theme. I think the rudeness is probably going to come back in the discussion. 5 minutes each, if you can, but you can overrun a little bit. Mike first, and then Nick.
Andy, on the RCP, I'm not going to respond Andy's question on the 1944 to 47 RCP. I'm not going to respond to it because it's a complicated, given the amount of time, it's a complicated story, except that I will say that it seems to me that the decision of the Fourth International to put the minority around Jerry Healey in control of the leadership of that organization set in motion the splits which destroyed it. It's by refusing to allow there to be a majority rule in the organization that it became impossible. Jake, I agree. The possibilities of it, it seems to me there is a real, I don't think there's a possibility of us suddenly creating an organization which is bigger than all the rest of the organizations at the far left and forcing them into our organization. But there's certainly a possibility of us creating a really positive dynamic if we can create an organization which is founded on a clear political basis and has open discussion and open debates. Danny, the misuse of power, it seems to me that the commonest way in which the misuse of power works in the far left organizations is by factitious disciplinary proceedings. That people get chucked out in order to manipulate the SWP, of course, you had in the fight over the Martin Smith rape allegations, you actually had direct ballot rigging by the apparatus, which of course you had in the CPSU in the 1920s, you had ballot rigging by the apparatus. The IMG when I was in it, ISG, etc., but also the Healyites. The characteristic thing was that people were expelled on charges of indiscipline. The split of 1953 in the Fourth International was triggered by the American Socialist Workers' Party expelling its roughly 1/3 minority, which wanted to get closer to the Communist Party, on the basis that they had been disloyal in failing to attend a political meeting, public meeting in New York. The other side of it is walking out in order to delegitimize the conference, which Taft did, claiming that he actually had the majority. But similarly, equally, Nahuel Moreno, I was at the bleeding meeting. It happens that where Nahuel Moreno and Pierre Lambert organised a split in the Fourth International in 1979. On the basis it was essential to walk out in order to delegitimize the conference. That's the opposite of democratic procedures. But the SWP, it's preemptive. You're not allowed to correspond between members of different branches outside of the pre-conference period. Whole mass of stuff of this sort. I'm not convinced that it's about. I actually think it's much more common for people to be slung out on the basis that they're allegedly being aggressive as a minority than it is for people to be intimidated into not raising their voices. I have to say that the leadership of the IMG was much ruder on both sides of the factional struggle than anything that either Jack Conrad or I have written in the Weekly Worker in the internal debates, and it didn't stop us, the opposition, the different tendencies, from continuing to fight. It was there. It was. However, the tendency, where does this tendency to split come from? I don't think it's a product of Trotskyism, Comrade O'Brien, because it's also true if you were to look at the history of American or French Maoism, you would find the exact same phenomenon. Yeah. It's an effect of, okay, it's misleading to call it Zinovievism, but if you have the ban on factions, the 1921 ban on factions, if you ban public factions, if you ban, as the Bolsheviks did in 1919, the local party organizations from publishing without the consent of the national leadership, the consequences of that is that it's tempting for people who are in a minority to walk out in search of fresh fields and pastures new. Yeah. But secondly, the idea is that it's wasting time to talk to debate among the members of the group. We ought to be out there. If we ought to be out there and not wasting time, quote, talking to ourselves, unquote, then prima facie, actually, any sort of internal discussion is a waste of time. Trotsky, I think correctly, in 1931, made the point, actually, the formation of the cadre of the party is a fundamental task, and that's only happen as a result of the internal debate. If you don't have internal debate, everything's dumbed down, and that's very visible to me, actually. The SWP is massively dumbed down from what it was in 74, 75 as a result of the end of factions. Flip side of it, the Bolsheviks held two conferences during 1917 in the middle of revolutionary crisis. It's too busy. We're too busy with the revolutionary crisis. We're too busy with the class struggle to hold democratic discussions. These are the standard form, common arguments of the far left, but it's actually the reverse. So the question, in essence, how do we get to? We can get to the creation of a moderately sized communist organization, which is open and democratic in its functioning, and because it's open and democratic in its functioning, can lever open the sardine tins of the, to some extent, lever open, Jake's point, the sardine tins of the existing left. To some extent, fight against this phenomenon. But it's not straightforward, but it's nonetheless the possibility, the prize is enormous. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. Over to you, Nick.
Okay, so really interesting discussion. Enjoyed it. Lots of new points have come up. and no doubt they've got to be discussed further. I'm going to say we need to make this work. We can't guarantee that it will work. If it does work, we can't guarantee that it won't split. There are no guarantees. Politics requires serious people to act seriously, and there's no allowing for other people to behave differently. So if we are communists and we're committed to the idea of building a mass communist party in which differences exist and are encouraged, then we've got to try to make that work. I agree with what Jake said about the the question of quantity and quality and the impact and so on. I have look, all of these things are going to have to be discussed, and discussion. Unless you're completely set in your ways and you're not open to any idea, in which case there's no point being in a party. But discussion and dialogue it does help to change minds. So, but at the moment, my position is this: look, we are trying to bring together 3 smallish organizations together. We need to have the propaganda of the need for unity, and we have to have the deed of carrying it out. And when we then have to show that we're actually implementing what we've argued in this meeting and elsewhere. Then there's the question of, well, okay, what do we do next? If we're propagandizing for unity of the communist left, then obviously we are making approaches to the other communist left. And so I wasn't quite understanding what Sachin was saying, because if the Finches are, basically going to, like an ass and a donkey, and you produce a mule, and then that's the end of it, then you say, well, what's the point of discussing with them? There's a point in discussing with them because we think that there's something to be gained from discussing with them. And I think that is important. However, I'm just going to raise this now. When we say we want to go through the existing left, we need to sort of like think about how we're going to go through them. Are we going to go through them with a broadsword through the stomach? Or are we going to go through trying to persuade them that our ideas are worth engaging with them? And even if they don't agree with us on everything, we should still be in the same organization. And therefore, it does come back to not just the question of the ideas. The ideas are important. And actually, the ideas are paramount. The politics, the program, that's paramount. But how we go about it, if you go to a factory, you take your ideas to the factory and you say you're all stupid, all you're doing is coming out on strike. You need to be getting involved in high politics, you idiots. We need to change the world. You'll get punched in the face, frankly. And so the question of how we conduct ourselves is important. I can't help smiling to myself when Mike says the problem with civility. I just think that that's an oxymoron. It's a sort of like a phrase that doesn't fit together. It's a contradiction. There is nothing wrong with civility. What would be wrong if we have a culture in which people don't raise their differences? And of course there are passions, and of course we will misspeak, and somebody will pull you to one side like they did with Lenin after various conferences, and he writes messages to others saying, oh, sorry about the way I spoke to you in that particular congress, and so on. And so we're living as comrades, particularly if it's in a small organization. But the culture and the question of how to address people, and I think there's an interesting exchange in the side comments. I think, is it Paul Cooper? The culture of discourse. It's an art, not something that can be. Yeah, it is an art. Leadership is an art, and sometimes you have to step away and you have to ask yourself, what do I look like to others? How is this going down with others? And you need to have, that's why collective leadership is so important. Somebody that says, pulls you by the elbow and says, that was out of order. And you want membership who are going to say that was out of order. And so the art is developed. And the problem with, if we're all in small groups where we've been used to ruling the roost and so on, that what was once perhaps an art has been forgotten, and you're so used to talking to other people, maybe the same people, that you get used to what you consider to be banter and everybody else takes as banter, but to the outside world doesn't look attractive at all. And it's for that reason that people don't join. And one of the things that I would say is the left needs to look at itself, each organization, and say, well, if we've got all of these ideas and these ideas are right and they're good, is there something else that is preventing people from joining us? These are just questions that we've got to ask and answer. I'm sure that through discussion, we can get there. And the last point I want to make is, even the small organization, Jake's point about the 50 comrades is more effective than 5 times 10, really important point. And I take Mike's point about the importance of discussion and debate, but we can't build a communist party and we can't build the nucleus of a communist party just on the basis of debate and discussion. At some stage, we have to engage with workers, and we have to take the good news of socialism or the good news of communism to the working class. And that's what even the Emancipation of Labour group, a tiny group, they did. They put out strike leaflets and so on, and you engage. And then it's not just you developing cadres in the abstract, in the discussion of the high theoretical debates and discussions in the party. You're discussing, or you're developing cadre in how to apply those ideas in a dialogue with workers, and how you refine how to put your arguments across. And you come back and, I tried out this argument and somebody came back with this, I hadn't thought about that. And you feed it. And that's how you develop a cadre, through interaction with the class and the ideas. And I think that if we pull this off, we'll have a good go at it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you both very much, Mike and Nick, and all the comrades who spoke and made comments in the chat. Really important discussion, and I think quite enlightening on some aspects, and will no doubt also inform Communist University in the discussions we'll have there. There will be a particular session on a good culture in a communist party, and I think that's actually an important one, and it does go, I think, to the heart of quite a few objections from comrades, or worries that comrades have, and it's best to talk about it openly without insulting each other, I think. Brilliant evening tonight. Thank you both.